When she finally passed into old age, her story was nearly erased. No obituary told the truth. No marker on her grave revealed the horrors she had endured. To the outside world, she was simply another woman from the hollow, another name swallowed by the soil. But beneath that soil lay generations of secrets, marriages that blurred lines of kinship, children who were both niece and daughter, son and grandson. Her life became just another link in a chain that stretched back centuries, binding the living to the sins of the dead. And yet, even in silence, the truth leaves marks. The descendants of that family carry it still, in their bodies, in their histories, in whispers that follow them wherever they go. For some, it is a shame they tried desperately to outrun. For others, it becomes a badge of survival, proof that they endured what others could not. But the stain of inbreeding is not easily washed away. It lives in memory, in rumor, in the uneasy way outsiders still speak of families like hers, long after their cabins have rotted into the earth. What her story reveals is not just the tragedy of one girl stolen from childhood. It is the tragedy of a system of silence, where neighbors watched but never intervened. A system of tradition where the word family was twisted until it became something monstrous. A system of poverty where isolation bred desperation and desperation bred decisions too dark to face in the daylight. She never had the chance to escape, but her story does. It leaks through the cracks of history, whispered by those brave enough to tell it, uncovered by those who refuse to let it stay buried. And though her name may be lost, her suffering remains etched in the forgotten archives of America's past, a warning, a scar, a testament to what happens when blood becomes prison. This is why we tell her story, because if we do not, silence wins again. And silence, more than cruelty, is what allowed this horror to exist at all. So the next time you hear the word family, remember hers. Remember the little girl forced to call her stepfather husband. Remember the cycle that consumed her, and ask yourself what stories are still being hidden right now in places no one dares to look. As the years went on, the cycle tightened its grip. The girl who had been forced into marriage at 9 became a mother before her body was ready, and the children she bore carried the same heavy inheritance: fragile health, strange appearances, minds clouded before they had the chance to clear. Some never made it past infancy. Others grew up repeating the only patterns they had ever seen. The bloodline folded inward once again, and with each fold, the family's world grew smaller, darker, more detached from the world beyond the hollow. Her stepfather aged, but he never changed. His control remained absolute. He kept her secluded, insisting that outsiders would never understand, that the family had to protect its own, no matter the cost. And though she had grown from a girl into a woman, he still held her as if she were a possession, something claimed, something bound. What had begun as abuse masquerading as tradition had calcified into a life sentence. The whispers in town grew louder over the years. Some spoke of curses, others of madness. Rumors spread that the family tree was no longer a tree at all, but a knot, a tangled mass of roots feeding only on themselves. Journalists would later stumble upon fragments of these stories, piecing together evidence of inbred marriages hidden for decades. But at the time, the truth stayed buried. Officials looked away. Clergy chose silence. Neighbors muttered, but did nothing, and so the family's horrors continued unchecked. For the woman herself, hope had long since faded. She never got the chance to imagine another life. No schooling, no friendships, no escape. She became the living embodiment of her family's curse, her name erased by the title of wife that was forced upon her before she even understood what the word meant. And yet, what lingers most hauntingly is not just her suffering, but the way it was accepted. A whole community knew. A whole community let it happen. It is here that history becomes not just a story of one man's cruelty, but a mirror showing us the quiet violence of indifference, the kind of evil that hides not in action, but in refusal to act. Time did not heal her. It hardened her. Each year passed like a sentence carved into stone. By the time she was 12, she looked older than her age, not from growth, but from the weight she carried. Her eyes had lost the softness of childhood. Her stepfather, now her so-called husband, kept her close, never letting her step too far beyond the threshold of their home. He claimed it was to protect her, but in truth it was to hide her, because even in a place where inbreeding was whispered about, what he had done was more grotesque than most dared to admit aloud. Children in the town called her strange. Some mocked her, some pitied her, but none truly befriended her. She was caught in a limbo, too young to be a woman, too marked to be a child. Teachers looked the other way when she stopped showing up at school. Ministers preached about sin from the pulpit, but avoided naming hers. Everyone seemed to know the truth, but no one wanted to stain their own hands by reaching in to save her. The silence around her was more suffocating than the abuse itself. It was as though the entire community had built a wall of denial around her suffering, brick by brick, until she was sealed inside. And in that silence she began to question whether she was human at all, or simply a ghost, walking through a life no one wanted to see. Her health faltered. Years of inbred blood had already made her fragile, and now, with the weight of pregnancy looming before her teenage years, her body buckled under demands it was never meant to carry. The town would later whisper that her children bore the signs, weak, frail, some never living beyond their first breaths. But for her, the tragedy was not only in the children she lost, but in the innocence she never had the chance to keep. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you have spoken out, or would you have stayed silent, like so many others did? Because silence, more than anything else, is what kept this story alive. It wasn't just her stepfather who imprisoned her, it was an entire community, an entire family tree that turned its back while she suffered. The nights were the worst. Darkness fell heavy in that house, pressing down on her small frame like a second skin. By day she could distract herself, fetching water, helping with chores, staring out the window at children who still played freely in the fields. But when the lamps went out, she was trapped. A child expected to lie beside a man she feared. Her stepfather's presence filled the room like a shadow that never moved. His touch was not love, it was ownership, and every breath she took seemed stolen from her. She learned quickly not to cry too loudly. Tears brought punishment, and punishment brought more silence. The family's rules were strict, though unspoken. Never speak of what happens in the night, never question the decisions of elders, never defy the bloodline. These weren't rules written in any book, but they were carved deep into her life, and each time she obeyed them, she lost another piece of herself. Outside those walls, whispers grew. Neighbors knew, everyone knew, but knowledge is not the same as action. Some excused it, claiming, "That's just the way their kind are." Others turned their faces away, afraid of being entangled in the family's secrets. And so, the girl remained unseen, even as her suffering grew louder in silence. The longer she lived as his wife, the more she felt the world closing in. She was too young to understand marriage, too young to understand betrayal, but old enough to feel the weight of chains. Her stepfather controlled everything: when she ate, where she went, who she spoke to. She wasn't a wife, she was a prisoner. And yet, even in that prison, she clung to small fragments of childhood, humming lullabies she once heard from her mother, clutching her doll until the fabric tore, whispering prayers into the darkness, hoping someone, somewhere, would hear. But no one came. In that hollow, the law of blood was stronger than law of man. And the girl's voice, too fragile to break through generations of silence, vanished into the very soil her family lived on. The roots of this horror stretched far back before the girl was ever born. To understand her fate, you have to see the soil she was planted in. Generations before her, this family lived isolated, tucked away in a hollow where the dirt roads wound like veins through the mountains. Poverty wasn't just an inconvenience, it was the air they breathed. Food was scarce, work was seasonal, and education was a luxury no one thought worth chasing. In such places, the family became its own world. Outsiders were rare, and when they did appear, they were treated with suspicion. So marriages year after year happened within. Cousin married cousin, uncle married niece, stepfather took stepdaughter. Each choice made sense to them in the moment. Keep the land together, keep mouths fed, keep the family from breaking apart. But every choice carried a hidden price, one that grew heavier with each generation. By the time the girl was born, her blood was already marked by centuries of repetition. Whispers surrounded the family. Children who were born sickly, minds that didn't develop fully, men with tempers that erupted without reason, women with eyes that looked too far away. Doctors seldom came to the hollow, but when they did, they left with quiet notes scribbled in journals, comments never meant to be read by the public. Words like congenital, feeble-minded, degeneration. Those words were the medical mask for what everyone in town already knew, but wouldn't dare put into speech. The bloodline was eating itself alive. And yet, they carried on. Some called it stubbornness, others called it blindness, but it was more than that. It was a cycle. When you are born into a world where every example you see has been twisted, you grow up thinking the crooked is straight. For the girl's stepfather, marrying her was not a monstrosity. It was what had been modeled before him, what had been whispered as acceptable, even necessary. He believed he was preserving family ties. In reality, he was tightening a noose around them both. The girl never understood the weight of that history. She only felt its consequences. Her body carried the fragility of inbred blood, her mind bruised under the weight of expectations no child could hold. She was 9 years old, but her world was already centuries old, heavy with sins committed long before she ever drew breath. The wedding itself was not the kind of ceremony you'd expect. There were no flowers, no music, no joyful gathering of friends and family. Instead, it was a dimly lit room, the smell of kerosene lamps heavy in the air, and the quiet shuffle of relatives who had seen this sort of thing before. The girl wore a plain dress, one of her Sunday best, but it hung loose on her tiny frame. She didn't understand what was happening. To her, it felt like a game she hadn't been taught the rules to, but to the adults, it was binding. It was the continuation of a tradition that no one dared to question aloud. Her stepfather, now her husband, stood tall, with eyes that never softened. He was in his late 20s, a man shaped by hardship and a twisted sense of duty. He didn't smile, didn't offer her comfort. He just placed his hand on her shoulder, claiming ownership of what was never his to take. In that moment, the child was stripped of her identity, no longer daughter, no longer free, but marked as property. The people around them justified it with words that had lost all meaning: survival, family, necessity. In their eyes, this union wasn't shocking. It was a way to keep blood, land, and loyalty contained. But what they called loyalty was, in truth, decay. With every generation that passed, the same faces grew more alike, the same ailments appeared in infants, and the same cruelty was handed down like a family heirloom. For the little girl, the days after the wedding blurred into something she couldn't name. There was no play, no schooling, no chance to laugh with children her age. Instead, she was kept close, watched carefully, expected to behave as a wife while still small enough to sleep clutching the tattered remains of her doll. The world outside her home went on as normal. Neighbors went to church, fields were plowed, babies were born. But inside those four walls, she lived in a twisted reality that no child should ever endure. And still no one spoke. Those who saw chose blindness. Those who knew chose silence. Because in their world, shame was worse than suffering, and reputation was more important than innocence. Her cries never left the house. Her story never left the family, at least not until now. She was only 9 years old when her childhood was stolen. The story I'm about to tell you isn't found in textbooks, and it's not the kind of tale families pass down at the dinner table. It's one that gets buried, hidden under shame, silence, and the weight of generations who knew something was wrong but chose to look the other way. Imagine a little girl, barely old enough to hold a doll, being told she was no longer a daughter, but a wife. Not to a stranger, not to a boy her age, but to the man who was supposed to protect her. her stepfather. The people in that small town whispered about it in passing, but they never dared to intervene. Because in families like theirs, where bloodlines already tangled together in ways that defied nature, the unthinkable had somehow become tradition. To understand how such a marriage could be forced upon a child, we have to go back, further than the moment vows were spoken, deeper than the day this little girl's life was rewritten. We have to peel back the layers of a family tree where the branches grew too close together, where cousins became lovers, where uncles became fathers, and where the line between kin and spouse blurred until there was no line at all. These families existed on the edge of America, in valleys and hollows where poverty clung to every wooden shack and secrets stayed locked behind weathered doors. Outsiders called them strange, cursed, or simply different, but within those walls these people called it survival. And yet survival carried a price. Each generation paid it in different ways. Deformities whispered about at birth, minds frayed too soon, tempers that boiled into violence, and in the darkest of corners, little girls turned into brides. It's here, in this forgotten bloodline, that we find her story. A 9-year-old child handed a ring she didn't understand, while adults around her told her this was her deed. Duty. She had no choice, no voice, no way out. The man who stood at her side that day was not just her stepfather. He was a product of inbreeding himself, born from a family where brothers and sisters once married, where the blood had been folded back on itself too many times. By the time he became her husband, the cycle had already been set in motion for decades. He was both victim and villain, shaped by the sins of his forefathers, yet inflicting the same darkness on the innocent child who trusted him. This is where our story begins, with a wedding that should never have happened, a marriage that became a prison, and a bloodline that shows us just how far human beings can fall when tradition replaces morality.